Hello and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Robin Whitten. Hey, Robin, how are you doing?
Oh, it's nice to be here, Matty. Thank you.
I am happy to have you here. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Robin Whitten is editor and founder of AudioFile magazine. She's passionate about audiobooks and the magic of the listening experience. She started AudioFile over 30 years ago, starting out as an avid listener, and her all-time favorite audiobook is The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, read by a full cast, which is definitely now going on my to be listened to list. I have to say, my favorite audiobook is almost anything read by Neil Gaiman, but Neverwhere. I've listened to Neverwhere probably 4 times.
Oh, well, I'm a big fan of Neil's and also of his performances. And The Graveyard Book is one of my absolute favorites of his.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's kind of maybe an interesting entree to our conversation that there's that combination of the author's work and then the narrator's work. And it's convenient when the author and the narrator are the same person and can deliver an equally fabulous performance on both those fronts. But that's got to be a little bit rare.
It is fairly rare. I mean, we're not all Neil Gaiman and have the skills in both camps, I think, of the writing as well as the performance. But being a good storyteller, it works in both worlds.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to get into more detail about some of the ways that you assess those things, but I first had to dive into something from your bio that AudioFile magazine has now been around for more than 30 years. And I'm wondering if you can comment, if you put yourself back at the very beginning of AudioFile magazine, maybe at the very beginning of your audiobook listening experience, if you were thinking about what you were going to expect to see in 2023, how have things panned out similarly to or different from what you expected?
Great question. I'm thinking about things in the early days of the 1990s. I thought that it wouldn't take so long for audiobooks to be on everyone's radar. I mean, I've had to hang on here for a long time. And now, of course, everyone knows what an audiobook is. But for really many years, I was always explaining what an audiobook was, followed by why I would be interested in not reading with my eyes. And that I thought, because there were a lot of listeners then, I thought that it would not take as long as it has to kind of have it much more accepted, much more mainstream, and really an alternate and sort of additional way of accessing stories for the majority of people.
You feel like there was an event that turned it around?
Well, I think there are a couple things. One is helped and continues to help people who are maybe reluctant or uninterested, is if you try a really good audiobook, it captivates you. The story captivates you. The form can captivate you. And it's good to start with something really exceptional. And so we have lots of good ideas. And the other thing I think is the demographics have changed a little bit, so that many readers who always read with their eyes were perhaps reluctant to try something different in some cases. And yet you have a younger generations coming along who are media babies. They don't have any preconceptions about why you wouldn't access a book through your ears. I mean, that barrier, which might have been there, might have been perceived, regardless of what it was, it's not there for younger people. Oh, audiobooks, cool, great. There's no bar to it. And I think that those things have changed, along with other things, the many more audiobooks being available, many types of voices being represented and representing the books. So all of those things have contributed to the growth and acceptance of audiobooks and the growth of listeners.
I think that there was a period of time where people just didn't want to try audio. Then there was a period of time, I think, where people were trying audio, but there was this conversation about, does it count if I listen to a book instead of read a book? What do you have to say to that?
Well, I've heard it.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that I thought was going to be kind of not hang around for as long as it did. But it has. I mean, I still have that conversation with people today, but not so often. And so many more listeners and so many more choices of things to listen to.
I think that one of the things that makes it tough is that there's not a comfortable generic way to express, I consumed the content in some way. Like you usually say, I read a book or I listened to an audiobook. You generally don't say, I consumed Moby Dick or whatever it was. And I wish there was a word like that, because as soon as you start talking about, I read a book, but I listened to an audiobook, I think it emphasizes the difference rather than emphasizing that they're just different ways of consuming the same content.
Right. So I don't make any difference. I'll tell you, I read it. If you want to quiz me on it, it's okay. Well, I can converse about it, which is the whole thing. But it is interesting. If you start to break it down, then it sort of triggers people's preconceptions about things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about this in a discussion that's going to be listened to and watched on YouTube by authors, because I think that the understanding better about how people are approaching this medium, the audio medium, is helpful when people are either looking for producers of their books or producing themselves or wondering if they're going to do that or not. But do you think that if an author were to come to you and say, do you think audio is worthwhile? And just setting aside the monetary side of it for the time being, but just from the experience of the listener, how would you address that kind of question? Like, how different or special will an audio experience be from the written word?
Oh, well, that's actually two questions, I think, at least. I think that one of the things about, is it worth it? Is it a good idea? Absolutely, for authors, because it totally expands the audience. It never diminishes the audience that has to pick. And actually, I think publishers initially were reluctant, that they thought that perhaps having more people listen to audiobooks would somehow diminish the number of people who would access in print a book. But it actually has proved many times over that it simply expands the accessibility of the audience. So you get more audience. You don't cut into one audience for a different format. So that's one piece of it. And I think the other piece of it is that there are lots of good reasons to look at audiobooks for authors. And it may not be as straightforward as it appears, except it's a good idea. And there are lots of things to know about it. And we'll talk about some of them, I guess.
Well, that's a great entree to talking about when authors, if they've decided to make the plunge into audio and now they're auditioning narrators. Do you have any tips for what people should look for? What are red flags if they're listening to, let's say, on a platform like ACX, which would be a way that people could get audiobooks onto Amazon and Audible? What kind of things should they be looking for or looking to avoid?
Well, I think that one of the things is the experience of the narrator, of the actor that you're listening to. It sometimes is hard in a sample of a couple minutes to really know what that actor can do in the long form, because your book is not 4 minutes long. Your book is not 1 hour long. They're going to have to sustain your story for hours. And the experience doing that is something that isn't just a count of audiobooks. I mean, on one hand, it is the count of audiobooks that someone has recorded, but it also is in the success of those performances. And I think, of course, I'm in the review business, so I would go have the authors look for reviews of things that the performer has done. And individual reviews, the customer reviews are one thing, but professional reviews are also something a little different. And it's good to have both. So to get a feel for, that's one way of really assessing the performer's skills. And, that you have to feel that they can connect with your story, because that's their job.
What are some things that you as a professional reviewer would note or comment on that a listener reviewer, a customer reviewer might not?
Well, I think that one of the really important things that consumer reviewers sometimes miss, and that I'm always encouraging our reviewers to really think about, is beyond being excited about a story, connecting with the story, to assess the performance of the narrator in a way of how emotionally connected the narrator is to the story, not how you as the listener are connected to the story, but whether you're really feeling that because of the story or because of the performance. It's not just the content. It actually, if the narrator is doing their job, it is how that narrator is creating a performance that connects you, and they are connected to the story emotionally.
Well, it does seem as if the expectation has moved away from having a narrator read a story to having a narrator perform a story. And that there's more of an expectation that people will do voices, will do accents, will invest it more like a performance than just a straight read of a story. Do you find that in general?
That's true. I think that is currently more preferred by listeners, but there are many levels of that kind of a performance, between an exaggerated, a big performance, or something that's very subtle, but is still doing all of those things of being character portraits, and making that emotional connection with you and the author's work and how they do that.
One of the things that I thought was interesting when I was auditioning narrators for my Lizzie Ballard thriller is that the first book has the protagonist starts out as a very young girl. She's 4 or 5, 6 in a couple of scenes. And I specifically told the narrators that I didn't want like a little girl voice. I don't want a little girl voice like this, because that would be horrible to listen to for the couple of hours that they would be doing that. And there was one narrator that I really liked, except she kept doing that. And I even went back a couple of times. I said, I love everything else you're doing, but please don't do the little girl voice. And she could never not do it. And I don't know if that was just, she felt that strongly about the portrayal of that character. I wasn't conveying what I wanted enough, but I guess it's also a hint that if you're auditioning narrators, you should make sure that they're reading all the main characters, that they're hitting all of them, so that you can get that sense. Like, I've read the advice that you should give them a scene to read that includes as many of the main characters as possible, and that you should give them a fighting chance by telling them things like, please don't read it in the squeaky little girl voice.
Right. And I think to also perhaps pick scenes that need a different emotional tone, whether it needs to be subtle, or it needs to be big, or it needs to encompass a number of different things. I think that might be interesting, as well as the variety of dialogue or, multiple characters.
When I was interviewing Gabriela Pereira, one of the things we talked about was matching the message to the medium. And one of the things that I said to her was that when I was producing my audiobooks with my audiobook narrator, one of the things that I wish I had told her to do, that I would tell her to do in future books, is if there's a long string of dialogue between two people, and she's very good at distinguishing the different voices, that she should take out some of the he says and she says, because it's sometimes necessary on the page to remind people, even when they're just two people talking. And then, of course, it gets worse when there are more people talking, to remind people of who the speaker is, or to let them know who the speaker is. Whereas if you have a narrator that is good at doing the voices and good at differentiating them, then you don't really need that. When you're listening to an audiobook, I'm assuming that most of the time it's an exact duplication of the written book. Is that a correct assumption?
That is. Yes, because it is supposed to be, unabridged, word for word. That's checked by the engineers. And to remove the he said, she said, that has to come from the author as a extra permission, because otherwise it's not the same. And I think a lot of publishers don't end up doing that, but it's an interesting idea. But I have to say that very skilled narrators also have a way of, I don't know if it's really suppressing, but reducing the impact of the he said, she said, so you don't even notice it. Because, of course, going back and forth, if there are a lot of he said, she says, that if you're noticing them every time, then that's not a good thing. It should flow. And I think that there are narrators who can do that in their performance. You just never notice that they are saying he said, she said, he said, she said, because you're so much into the dialogue.
I would think it would also be useful to give narrators a general sense of the type of material they're going to be dealing with. Like, there's going to be a really explicit love scene, or there's going to be a lot of swearing, or things like that, because there might be people who just don't feel comfortable with that. And I actually have seen narrators, now that I'm thinking about it, I have seen narrators who specify in their resume that they don't do certain things. Like normally I see it about erotica. But you'd hate to sign on a narrator and then they get halfway through your book and then they encounter some scenes that they're now contractually committed to perform, but they feel really uncomfortable about it. And I would think that would be a quick way to undermine that emotional connection that you're talking about.
Well, I think that probably as much as possible, narrators would like to know, but they also should be asking good questions and trying to do a little research to get information. But as an author, you can do research about the variety of titles that a narrator has done.
Yeah. And I think you can capitalize on the fact that many audiobook listeners will follow a particular narrator or performer. And that my sense was that the people who were charging a premium had huge fan bases. Had good reasons to do it. They were not only skilled performers, but they were bringing a fan base along that otherwise would not necessarily find your book. And that there's the pool of listeners who will listen to everything. We talked about Neil Gaiman. I'll listen to anything Neil Gaiman does. I love all of Neil Gaiman's books, but I don't necessarily automatically buy his books if they're narrated by somebody else. And so it's another decision to make, that you're buying yourself an audience if you spend that extra money for someone who has a large following.
Oh, I think that's true. And I think that experience really does count. Experience and, success with the audiobooks. And that is defined by different things of reviews or being hired to do high profile books, all those things. There's a certain amount that you do bring along because listeners get very devoted to voices. And oftentimes they will, as you say, follow a narrator simply because they like the way they treat the material, and that they are great storytellers and they can adapt to all kinds of different stories.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, going back to the conversation we were having about performance versus reading, that it's almost like a golden age of radio drama, because I think that people probably feel more comfortable with audiobooks now that they're podcasts and serials and those things that really harken back to old time radio dramas. And that not only encourages people to be looking for the performances, but I think also makes it less important that the narrator have a perfect speaking voice. As these other kinds of audio experiences come along, it widens the scope of the type of voice that an audience is willing to listen to. What are you seeing in terms of an expansion of voices like that? Is that playing out in the audiobook world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, I think we have become better listeners in the sense that we listen to more things. There's a lot of range when you listen to people on podcasts, and people listen to podcasts because they're interested in what people are talking about or the story that is being told. And that whole performance piece is not really there. So the radio drama tradition that is much more prevalent in Britain sort of never left, but we had it here and then we sort of lost it. I think culturally people didn't listen to the radio, and it's like talk radio took over and you didn't have dramas or stories or as much documentary kind of work on radio as there was at one time. And yet now there's more of that. And so we have more people listening to different types of audio programming, including audiobooks. And the different voices, the number of people that are involved as narrators in the audiobook world has expanded tremendously. There's been a lot of outreach to make the industry accessible to different actors who come from different backgrounds and might not have been exposed or had the chance to think about audiobooks. There's a lot of interest in cultural diversity so that you can, as an author, you can try to match some of the elements of whether it's something that's in your story or in your own background with the narrator that you're hiring.
It raises the issue of narrators narrating their own books. So we've talked about Neil Gaiman, great writer, great voice, great performer. If authors are thinking about making that decision, what would you, as a reviewer of audiobooks, advise them to consider?
Well, I would advise them to consider that it's harder than it looks. And that as an author, you do a talk at the library or in a bookstore, if you're lucky enough to have bookstores around who are doing programming, but you might read a segment for 10 minutes. That's not the long form that you're going to be looking for if you have to read your entire audiobook. And I think that authors know the story inside and out. They know the characters inside and out. But whether that can be translated into the audio presentation, the performance of that is the question you have to ask. Do you have any acting training? Do you know anything about, as a writer, you know all about writing, but what do you know as a performer? And what do you know about being a storyteller in the long form and of a vocal presentation?
Yeah, I think that even the physical side of that, I know I tried a couple of times to do narrations of my own nonfiction books, and I could really only do about, I don't know, half an hour of recording at a time, which might end up being 15 minutes of actual finished time. And I thought, oh man, at this rate, I'm never going to be done. It's never going to be done.
Never going to be done. And if you have an engineer or a director saying, could you do that again? You just mispronounced a word, which you were sure that you had said right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not only the recording, but it's also the listening back. And I just always have to put a plug in that for people who are hiring people, whether you're doing it yourself or having somebody else do it, you always have to listen to the whole thing, because it is so easy to say sister when you really meant brother, and things that seem odd in retrospect, but are easy to do, even for a professional when they're reading.
Right. And being absolutely sure that the pronunciation of some word you've used is exactly right. Maybe not.
Yeah, I almost dinged my narrator on a pronunciation thing, and then I've learned always to look it up before I say you pronounced that wrong. And in that case, I was like, oh no, she did pronounce it right. I've been pronouncing it wrong my whole life. How embarrassing.
Well, if you haven't heard it pronounced, you might have read it a bunch of times, but you might not know.
Yeah. So I guess that's a lead into AI-generated audio. So this is the hot topic now. I'll use as an example that I have an AI-narrated version of one of my nonfiction books. I have two nonfiction books, one which I wrote by myself, one of which I wrote with male co-author Mark Lefebvre, and we had been waiting to do that one in audio until we could have different chapters read by one male voice, one female voice, and I think we've gotten to that point now technically. I think it is very listenable if the goal is to absorb content, absorb information. And I've not found that in general with fiction where a performance is desired until pretty recently. I had somebody send me an example of an AI-generated passage of an argument between two people, and it was really well done. Like the escalating emotion of the situation. Now, I don't know what all went into creating that. It could have taken the people who are moving levers 4 times as long to create that as it would a narrator. But I'm just curious about your thoughts about the rise of AI narrated audio.
Well, I think that there are certainly areas where AI is going to be part of our life. It already is. I'm not sure. I'm not a big fan of audiobooks, books being narrated with AI voices, simply because I care too much about the performance. And I think what's been happening is there's been a lot of manipulation of the technology so that narrator may record all of the vowel sounds and all of the things that go into that feed into the sausage. And yet I don't buy the emotional connection, because it's all being programmed in. It's not being felt. And I think as a listener, I can hear that. And in nonfiction, I get the point of it's just information that we're absorbing, but I still think that there's room for the kind of performance that a skilled nonfiction narrator can do, which has to do with pace. It has to do with tonality. It has to do with really intellectually understanding what you, the author, are intending. And I don't think machines do that.
It's interesting that a human narrator working with a human author on a performance of their book, you would hope that the book itself would provide the emotional basis that the narrator would need to do that. And I'm just trying to think through what lessons an author could gather from listening to someone perform their work. So as an example, in one of my early books, there was a scene between an adult son and his father. And I had written it with the expectation in my head that the son is being a jerk and the father's getting annoyed with him. He's getting frustrated with him. When my narrator read it, it was clear that her interpretation was the son was being reasonable and the dad was just being an angry jerk. And it was very informative, because I could then look back through the words that I put on the page and say, yeah, that's kind of a legitimate interpretation as well. Now, because that scene set up a lot of things that happened later in the book, yeah, I did ask her if she could redo it. She very graciously redid that scene to interpret it more the way I'd intended. But when you're reviewing an audiobook, are there any lessons that you draw from that you think the author should take as a lesson for future books?
Well, I was going to say that narrator wasn't connected to your intent, which is their job to come back. That's their job, is to get your intent. So you were right to say you didn't get my intent and you need to do that over.
But it's understandable too. Like, if I'd made the scene clear, she probably would have gotten it right.
So then
it's kind of a responsibility on both sides. Yeah.
So then as a writer, you might take that into your next book, but you can't rewrite it while they're in the studio.
Well, and I suppose in some cases you can, because for a lot of indie authors, I think my experience is common that the ebook gets out there, the print book gets out there, and then later on the audiobook gets out there just because of the production time is longer. And there have been a couple of times where here's an example, my narrator sent me a note saying, you say evidently a lot. And I was intending it to be a scenario where the point of view character is making an observation about someone else, and they can't really say they didn't know what they were talking about. They have to make an assumption. So she would say, they evidently didn't know what they were talking about, but I evidently really overused it. So I went and searched for evidently in my book, and I was like, whoa, she's right. Way too much evidently. And I ended up taking it out. And then as an indie author, I could quickly republish the ebook. So it's actually kind of a cool thing that independently published authors can do, is to take learnings from the audiobook, even if you're going back and making an update to a book that's already out there.
Well, my question would be, isn't that what your editor was supposed to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, but it's sort of like proofreading. You can have 6 proofreaders read something, and the 6th one will always find like that one last thing on page 372 that the other 5 missed. Or it was a tick of mine that the editor didn't mind, but the narrator did.
Well, I think it is something that as a listener, I actually realize now that what you're talking, this example is something that listeners notice how often the word evidently comes up.
Yeah.
Because I will be listening to something and I thought, I just heard that sentence or very close to that sentence a minute ago. I mean, I just exactly heard that same thing was said exactly the same way. Interesting.
Yeah.
Usually just passes on, but
yeah, you can kind of skim over it with your eye, but when you're listening to it, you can't skim over it. And in fact, that's what I always do with my books before I finish the ebook. I always listen to it with Siri or whatever, have it read it out to me, because I do pick up things like that. You're just like, whoa, I've read that 100 times. And did I ever notice that? No, it's not until you hear it that it comes home to you.
Well, that is interesting. But I think that is part of the process in the writing. That's very useful.
Yeah. You had said before about one of the challenges of doing an author narrating their own works is the length of the work. Are you seeing any rise in the interest in short stories, audio narrated short stories?
I have been seeing more interest in short stories, and I think this comes in response to the interest in podcasts and the demographics of podcast listeners, because there's a huge number of podcast listeners who are not listening to audiobooks yet, I'd like to say, and they're not. And sometimes when you talk to people who listen to a lot of podcasts, I'm always trying to have that conversation. They often say, well, oh, they're very long. Oh, they're so long. And I think that is a barrier. And so a short story breaks down that barrier a little bit. And the other thing that we've tried with one of AudioFile's podcasts is to serialize an audiobook into the chapters. It's not very fancy. It's just you're taking a chapter and making it a podcast episode, and then you're taking another chapter and making that a podcast episode. And that we're hoping, and I think it does to a certain extent, it breaks down some podcast listeners' preconceptions about audiobooks, seem too long, or somehow there's something that they're not familiar with, and yet they listen to loads of podcasts. So it's interesting to me how you bridge that gap and interest them in a full-length book.
Yeah, this is something I'm keeping an eye on, because my narrator for my novel-length works just recorded the first short story that I'm currently selling on my direct sales platform on PayHip. I haven't really put it up anywhere else yet, but I will be putting it up on different, like, Findaway Voices. And I think I'm charging $1.99 or something like that. It's 35 minutes, but it's anything having to do with pricing with audiobooks is tricky, because although, there are more viable alternatives now than there were when I started out. So when I started out as an indie author, ACX, which fed Amazon and Audible, was pretty much the only game in town. And now I think Findaway Voices is the big platform that people think of as an alternative to Amazon. And so you could put something up for $1.99 on Findaway and it's not a big problem, but you really can't on Amazon or Audible, because for anyone who's using credits, they're going to say, I'm going to spend a credit on 35 minutes, or I'm going to spend a credit on 12 and a half hours,
right?
Where they're going to spend their money.
The other thing is the sampling aspect of, if you're putting up, well, I'm a fan of sample chapters. I'm a fan of samples in general, because oftentimes for free, actually, because we try it. And it's like, if it really interests me, then I will take the next step and purchase a full-length collection of stories. Or in the case of the way we're serializing the audiobooks, it's not because we're selling them, but if you take any book and you break it up into a bunch of chapters, which are separated by a little in and out, and hi, we're here today to give you chapter 4, it's really annoying. So if you really wanted to listen to that entire story, you would just go and purchase it as a complete, seamless audio recording, and not fool around with these these chunks.
What books are you using for this trial?
It's called Audiobook Break. And because we're working with publisher partners, and we're sort of having to stay in the public domain primarily because the rights to podcast, it gets very confusing and complicated. So for the most part, we're doing public domain titles. We started with David Copperfield, which of course was released initially as a serial, which I thought that was kind of fun. And we're right now, just last week, we launched a season with Winnie the Pooh, something light and very happy and lovely for the winter season, I think. It's a great favorite. And Barbara Rosenblatt, who's a brilliant narrator, did a performance of the Winnie the Pooh stories. So, and those are little chapters, little stories unto themselves.
Yeah, there's a great companion piece to this discussion. Episode 147 was Writing for Audio with Kelly Simmons, and Kelly had narrated her own serialized story, Open the Window, and it was a podcast. You could wait until the end and listen to them all, which is what I did because I don't like to stop partway through. And she was really saying that with technology as it is, this kind of thing with podcast platforms available very easily, this was something that any author should consider. But that the tricky part she called out was this idea that you had to have one long story, but you had to have a little cliffhanger at the end of each. So it wasn't just an arbitrary breaking up of the story. It was more a craft thing than a technical thing to make it enjoyable for the consumer.
Interesting. Yeah. To get you from one episode to the next.
Yeah. And also to do it in a way, ideally, that accommodates both the person who's binging it and the person who's just listening to it as it comes out. Right. So many things happening in audio. Are there other trends you see in audio coming down the pike that would be helpful for authors to be aware of?
Well, I think authors do have a lot more choices in different kinds of performance styles and formats. We talked a little bit about the formats, but also there's quite a renewed interest in both multiple voices, which sometimes I call an ensemble of voices. So if you have 3 or 4 narrators who are doing different parts of a story, and also a cast where there's actually interaction, which takes quite a bit more audio production expertise. But there's a lot of interest in that, and having a soundscape or using sound in a very creative way for authors, which may amplify the story depending on who the audience is. Very popular, and certainly in sci-fi and fantasy.
Yeah, it does seem as if there's a huge spectrum, that there could be people who are writing material where they could just sit down with their iPhone and earbuds and record something, and they would have a pool of people who would be interested in consuming that, purchasing it, or just getting it for free or whatever. And then there's the multicast soundscape sort of thing. So you shouldn't look at one of those and assume that's it, and that all those other audio options are close to you.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of good options because the audience is bigger and not everyone wants to listen to the same. So actually, we did an interesting interview with Malcolm Gladwell, who has now his own audio production company called Pushkin. But he was talking about how what he likes to produce is a very multifaceted program that has archival material and it has a lot of production in it. He says, single voices are so boring. Well, he had some interesting points, but single voices are not just boring to everyone. So,
right.
All right.
Yeah, it's as with everything else, it's deciding what product you want and then finding the audience that's going to love that and not some different take on it.
Right.
So cool. Well, Robin, thank you so much for talking with us. Please let everyone know where they can find out more about you and AudioFile Magazine online.
All right. Well, audiofilemagazine.com is our website. And from there, you can find reviews and profiles of narrators. For authors, we also have a talent directory on the site, so you can look up different actors who are available and interested in recording audiobooks. You can find our podcasts. We're all audiobooks all the time.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matty.